Okay, we're continuing on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph in the fifth parak of Bava Metzia Mafkid. We had started the sugya of discussing kefil and how and when kefil can be sort of exchanged or traded by the owner of the property with the shomer that he's involved with. So we're just going to retrace our steps to get started with that because it's a continuation from where we are. It's about the middle of the page, Amarav Papa. Last few words of the line, Amarav Papa. So here we're going to discuss this subject of kefil and how it comes about that the shomer can be the new owner of kefil, because really kefil is something that the owner of the object is entitled to. But since under these circumstances we're going to see, he conveys it to the shomer. Amarav Papa. Shomer chinam kivin shomer prashati machnele kfela. What does that mean? A shomer chinam is not responsible for anything other than pshia, meaning if he's careless, he's responsible, but if it's stolen or lost or damaged in any way, since he's a shomer chinam and he doesn't get paid, he is not responsible. But for pshia, he is chayiv. So let's analyze this. If he says it was stolen, that's it, story over. I mean, he's not chayiv. But in this particular case, he is negotiating with the owner and he says, you know what? I fess up to the fact that I was careless. But careless means that I owe you the value of the object. Let's say the value of the object is $100. So he makes an agreement with the owner that he'll give him the $100. So now the owner is not out anything, right? He's whole. And in exchange, the owner conveys the future potential of kefil to the shomer. Now, what does that mean, the future potential? As we discussed a couple of weeks ago, kefil isn't automatic. If a person converts a property and he confesses to Beis Din, let's say I stole something, so l'chayra I'm chayiv kefil, right? But if I go to Beis Din and I say, Beis Din, I'm fessing up to the fact that here's the object, I made a mistake, I took it, whatever. No kefil. There's no kefil. He has to pay for the object, or return the object, but there's no kefil. So kefil, in a sense, is a risk. So what is the owner doing here? The owner is risk averse. He says, you know what? I'd rather have my object back and give up the rights to future potential profit through kefil. And the shomer says, you know what? I agree. Here's your object back. I was pesheya. You convey to me the rights to kefil, and I'll take my chances. Either I'll get it or I won't get it. So that's what Rapapa is saying here. Shomer chinam kivin shomer prashati machnele kefela. Why? And then, so we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I said it's like a migo that he has. When I look at Tosfos says it is a migo. Okay, it's the Tosfos ahead of us, Shoel ad sheyishalim. It deals with the Shoel, but it says, so Tosfos says in so many words, it is a migo. In other words, I could have said that it was stolen and I would have been completely off the hook. Now that I say I was pesheya, I was careless, and I'm on the hook, therefore I'm believed with a migo.
Excuse me, Rabbi, if this is all verbal, there's no witnesses, nothing is written down.
This is a verbal discussion between, now they can memorialize it afterwards in a document, but this discussion is the shomer chinam coming to the owner and saying, you know what, I made a mistake. I was careless. I left the door open, the cow left, or whatever the case was, I'm responsible. So because he is being maida, and he didn't have to, he had a migo, he could have said it was stolen, it was lost. So that migo entitles him to say it. Now, the owner doesn't have to accept it, mind you. This isn't a one-sided thing. But we're talking about an owner that is risk averse and he'd rather have his chayfetz, his item, whatever it is, back and not worry about kefil down in the future. So Rav Papa says that's entirely appropriate. Now, what about a shomer sachar? Given she'ama nigneva machnele kfela, says the Gemara. Same thing. Since he fesses up and says it was stolen, because he's only chayiv for gneva and aveda. So since he says it was stolen, machnele kfela di boy pata nafshe b'shvura. Oh, we could have said b'shvura umesa. It died. It broke. It died. In other words, things that are beyond his ambit of responsibility, he can. He's not responsible for. So if he's a maida and he says it was stolen, same thing. It's a migo. Therefore, he is chayiv. And he's willing to barter with the owner and pay him for the value of the item, and then he gets kefil. Okay. So now we see that that's possible both by shomer chinam and about a shomer socha. Now, what about a shoel? What do we know about a shoel? The shoel is someone who borrows an item from somebody else. He doesn't compensate him, or it's a one-sided track affair. The shoel benefits the owner. Well, I mean, he gets a mitzvah maybe, but there's nothing physical that he gets back in exchange for lending to the fellow. Now, says the Gemara, something different. Shoel shama hareni mishalem lo maknele kefela. If a shoel confesses and he wants to pay, says the Gemara, no kefil. What do you mean no kefil? Why isn't he like a shomer chinam? He can barter. Says the Gemara, b'mai havalela mifta nafshe. What's the migo, so to speak? How is he going to free himself? The mesa machmas malacha. By saying Mesa Machmas Balacha. That's the only thing that the shoel can get out of. What does that mean? That means if it dies, let's say he lent him an animal, and the animal is a work animal, and the animal dies during the course of the work, that's called Mesa Machmas Balacha, then the shoel is not responsible. Why? As Rashi will say, because the only reason why he borrowed it is for its work habits. And if its work habits are such that it can't carry the load, we're talking about for a work product that is within its norm, not something that's leflim mishuras, their capability. You can't ask a cow to run, to run in an animal marathon or something weird like that. But I'm saying it has to be something that the cow can possibly do. So since it's the norm, therefore it says the Gemara, Mesa Machmas Malacha lo shchiach. It's not, that's out of the norm that it would die in the course of its work. If it's a healthy animal, it should survive. So there's no migo. Therefore, the owner cannot transact this deal, so to speak, where he'll take the value of the animal and give up kefil. Okay. So that is the essence of what the Gemara is telling us. Now, okay, so with this in mind, it's clear that there are some cases. Now, okay, let's stop and say for a minute, when is the transaction valid? When does it actually happen? So we follow earlier what Rashi had said, that it is the kinyan. In other words, there has to be a kinyan here, an exchange of ownership, when the person confesses and the owner says, yes, I will take the money and you take kefil. So Rashi tells us that, Rashi tells us that so these are the previous Rashis, that the actual transaction takes place at the time that he conveys to him the animal for work. So in other words, the owner takes the animal, he gives it to the shomer. The shomer makes a kinyan, and he says, "Okay, I'm making a kinyan, and I'm now a shemachinam, I'm a shemesachar, I'm a seicher, whatever it happens to be. So at that moment, there is an exchange of tentative ownership. It's only tentative because he plans on giving it back to him, but there is nevertheless a kinyan, because without that kinyan, this whole subject that we're talking about would be questionable. How could you make this exchange and say that he's going to give him the $100 and he's going to own the kefel? Where does he get the kinyan to own? Remember, giving money doesn't make a kinyan. Giving money is the transaction that supports the kinyan between the two parties. So therefore, the Gemara has to tell us that there was a kinyan. And when was the kinyan? The kinyan was conveyed, just like when you do the chiras chametz, right? You do first a kinyan, and then you can pay money. You want to give money, you can give money or not. But the kinyan is what makes the ownership change from you to, say, the rabbi who then sells the chametz. Same thing here. The kinyan is what exchanges from the owner to the shomer. And now he's the owner, and therefore he can later say, okay, I'm paying you. So this is the shita in Rav Papa. Now, says the Gemara weiter, no, there is another view in Rav Papa that we have to acknowledge. Ikar de Amre. There's an Ikar de Amre in Rav Papa, which says as follows: Amr Rav Papa, Shoel Nami. Shoel is no different than a shomer chinam or a shomer sachar. Since he says, I want to pay for the value of the animal, then you get kefo. What's the migo? The boy pata napshi b'misas machmas malacha. So according to this shita, misa machmas malacha is a valid form of migo. We had said earlier that in the regular view, that it's not, that it's lo shchiach, it's not likely that it would die, and therefore you can't convey. Says the Ikad Amri, no, we don't buy it, and it is just as good as any other kinyan, that if he says, if he wants to give a migo and say b'misah malacha and be free, so therefore the owner should take the money, and because he had already conveyed to the shower, like we said with the kinyan, therefore it's okay. So we have two views in Rav Papa on the shoel. On the shomer chinam and the shomer sacher and the seicher, there's no question that there is a migo, what we call a migo, and therefore he can transact and give him the money and take control of kefel. Now, again, we're making a big thing about this, but think about it. Kefel has a twofold purpose. Number one, it's a deterrent because it could be very expensive. You could have sold something expensive, and doubling the price is no small matter. But also, it's important to understand that the owner himself, he doesn't want kefil. He wants his item. So if he's risk averse, that there is such a mechanism that allows him to recover and give something up, because there has to be an exchange. I mean, why would the shomer pay him $100 just for what? And he's making up that he's pshia. He's being made to pshia. Why would he do that? Because kefil has a real value, and if the parties are willing to exchange money for kefil, then it's okay. So we see two shitas in according to Rav Papa, we see two shitas in Shoel. One allows for kefil, and one does not allow for kefil. Okay. So now we're going to try to resolve this, and we're going to look at a brisa. So a brisa on something a little bit different. Amalei Rav Zvid. Comes Rav Zvid, and he says, Hocha Oma Abaya. Abaya was the gadol, and he says, I'm going to tell you something that Abaya said. Okay, in other words, Abaya is going to be sort of the final say on this. Okay, what does Abaya say? Abaya. No, I'm sorry. Back up. My mistake. So Amabaya Shoel Achi Shalim, that the Shoel does not convey Achi Shalim. Okay, so here we're going to touch on what I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that the nuance in the language of what is said becomes very important. In other words, what I raised at that point was the question of whether or not you actually have to pay or pledge to pay. So what's the circumstance? A person, let's say, rents his item to the, or he gives it to Shem Achidim, or rents it to Shem Sachar, and it gets lost, gets stolen. Now, the question of kefel. So the Shem Sachar comes back and he says, you know what? I'm going to pay you for this, so make you whole, and therefore I'll be entitled to kefel. Question: does he actually have to pay the money, or does he have to pledge to pay the money? Let's say he has to pay him $100. So is it a pledge? I will pay you $100 and I'm now the owner, and that's sufficient? Or does he have to hand over $100? That's the question that the Gemara is raising, and that will be the subject of our further discussion as well. So Legabe Hashoel, in this brisa, okay, Abaya said, Ad she yishalem. So Abaya comes out and says, until he actually pays, there is no transaction. Why? My tama, hoel v'chol hano shalo b'shalo. Because it's a one-sided transaction. Why is it one-sided? Because the shoel doesn't pay any money, he just borrows. So the owner gets no hana from the shoel. At least from the shomer sachar, he gets a wage. From the shomer chinam, he gets the benefit of a free watching, because he needs someone to watch over it. So he gets some benefit. With the shoel, he's doing a mitzvah. He's giving the other fellow the opportunity to use it, and he gets nothing back. Says Abaya, in order to level the playing field, if the shoel is going to acknowledge, yes, I am responsible, then at the very least he has to pay. Why? Because it's a one-sided transaction. Only he gets benefit, the owner gets no benefit. Okay. Now, so that's Abaya's pronouncement. Ubedibura says, says the Gemara, lo machnele kefela. Just with words, you don't get kefel. The shoel saying, you know what, it's really my responsibility. That's not a catalyst for kefel. So there has to have been some kind of action, meaning that he borrowed it, he worked, he paid him money, he did something. Okay, so Abaya makes that clear. Now, a raya to that, Tanikavasa de Rav Zvid, a raya that this is in fact the case, because the brisa says Hashoel para mechavera. This is a different brisa. Hashoel para mechavera benignava, right? A shoel who borrows the para to work benignava, and so he's chayiv for geneva. B'kidem hashoel b'shilem, and the shoel kidem means he gets ready. The kidem hashoel b'shilem v'achakach nimtza haganev mishalem tashlumei kefel l'shoel. So that brisa makes it very clear that if he went ahead, the kidem, that's the key word. It means he undertook to pay, which we will, for translation purposes, say means he paid, right? This is the nexus to what Abaya said. And therefore, the ganef was found, he has to pay kefel to the shoel. So that's a raya. That's a raya that if he actually goes ahead and pays, then the kefel belongs to him. Okay, fine, good brisa. Now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, that sounds very interesting, but I have a problem. Lelishna kama de Rav Papa. Remember, we have two Lishonos, two interpretations of Rav Papa. The first interpretation is that a shoel cannot acquire because misa machmas malacha lo shchiach, meaning that it's not likely that it'll die in its work. Therefore, there's no migo. Therefore, he has nothing to barter with. The shoel has nothing to barter with, and therefore he cannot own kefel. That was the first version. The second version of the Iked Amri says Misha Masmach Malacha is likely. And if he says, yes, it died and I'm chayiv and I want to pay for it, that he's allowed to. Those are the two views in Rav Papa. So Lalishna Kama de Rav Papa, according to the first lashon of Rav Papa, Vade lo habati yufta. This brisa is not a question because he's paying for it. It isn't. Oh, it died, and therefore I should be entitled to kefel, and we'll make a deal. Blah blah blah. No, he paid for it. He bought it. He bought the animal. So if he bought the animal, then there's no question that he's entitled to kefel because he's now the owner. So he's saying Lalishna Kama, we're okay, which makes sense because he paid for it. But Lalishna Basra, Lemitava Tiyufta, according to the second lashon in Rav Papa, that how do you have it's a kasha? Why is it a kasha? So let's take a quick look at Rashi. The Rashi right to the side there. Lalishna Kama de Rav Papa Vade lo yahava tiyufta. There's no kasha. The name given the Tama de Rav Papa mishum de lo yahava lamafta nafshe the hamisa machmach malacha lo shchicha. Afilu kodem afilu kidem b'shilem nami isle Rav Papa de lo kane. So then, according to Rav Papa, if he pays, what's the difference? Nama de lo kane like fela. The tikshale, and we ask for vade lekela smuye the mocha amalach ano afal pisha amaharini mishalim amrei v'loy amrei afal pisha shilem. So what Rashi is saying here, that it's not a pledge to pay, it's an actual payment. If it's an actual payment, then it takes it totally out of the realm of the potential, because I'll pay you and therefore I should be the owner. So Rashi says it's not a kasha, it's not a stira. In other words, you can say that misa malacha is lo shchiach. You can still say that, but if he goes ahead and pays for it, it's no different than any other exchange. I come to you and I want to buy your animal. Here's $100, and the owner says, fine. Now I'm whole. By the way, this animal, if it ever if it's stolen or anything ever happens, and you're entitled to all the benefits that come with the animal, kefil, whatever it is. That's the completely neutral transaction, and it's okay. But the Lishna Basra, according to the second version says that you're allowed to say that the animal will die machmas malacha. So therefore, now says Rashi, name it havet yufta. So is it enough that he commits to paying? The time on the Brisa says he has to pay. So now the kasha is verbally, what happens if he commits to him and says, I'm going to pay you for this. I'm going to pay you. And Abaya says, no, you have to have had paid. You have to physically hand over the $100. So now you have a stira, you have a kasha on the second version. On the first version, it's enough to say that he committed to it. Why? Because if he commits to it and he gives him and he'll say, I'll give you the $100, then it's okay. First version. But on the second version, where he actually has to give him the 100 and he hasn't given it to him, why would it convey? So on the second version, where we believe the shoel to say was misa machmas malacha, we have a kasha, and the kasha is, it says in the brisa you have to pay, and here he's only making a commitment to pay, but he hasn't actually delivered the $100. Why should it belong to him? So says the Gemara, it's a kasha on the Ikeda Amre. Why did the Amre say that he's allowed to become the new owner and get kefel when he didn't actually come to pay? Me name it the Shila Dafka Ka'ama Tana de Brisa. The Tana de Brisa says you have to bedafka pay, not commit to pay. So we have an interesting discussion here that we can think about. Is committing to pay sufficient for ownership? So according to Abaya, who makes this pronouncement, it's not sufficient. You have to have already paid to become owner. And why? By a shoel, remember that a shoel, the owner gets no benefit. It's just a one-sided affair. in order to make it fair to the owner, we say b'dibur b'da'alma, just because he said I'm going to pay you, that's enough to assuage the owner to say, okay, I agree with you. Says the Gemara, no. That perhaps in a case where he got schar, let's say the owner got some rental from a seicher or something. There, I might have a havamina to say, the Gemara will discuss, that if I say I'm going to pay you, then you say, okay, I agree, because I already got schar. I already got something out of this exchange. I got a rental agreement. I got money. But if it's going to be dibur of the alma, if it's just going to be verbiage, because he says, I lent you this item for your benefit. I'm not asking anything back. And you're telling me I'm going to pay you. So where am I? I'm out in left field. I have nothing. So therefore, in that case, that's why it's a kasha on the Iked Amre. Iked Amre says it's good enough to say I'm going to pay you. No, it's not. The Brisa says you have to pay. Okay, so that's the kasha. All right. Let me tell it to you. Omalach Rav Papa. So comes Rav Papa, and Rav Papa is going to try to sort of balance this out. Omalach Rav Papa. Mi ileiman misnisan. Is the Brisa stronger than our Mishnah? This Brisa that Rav Zvid just quoted, is it stronger than our own Mishnah? Why? Because Diktani, we learned in our Mishnah, Shilem, that he pays, right? What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, Hamafkid, Eitzel Chaver Behemo Kalim, Benigro Shavdu, Shilem V'loi Rotzo Lishava. He pays and he doesn't want to swear. That's our Mishnah. And what does our Mishnah mean? V'ukma. So, v'ukmina ba'omar. And we learned pshat in the Mishnah that he meant v'omar. He said, I'm going to pay. Not that he paid. We interpret our Mishnah to mean I'm going to pay you in the future. Hachanami ba'omar. So the kasha is, you want to learn from this brisa, that this brisa is telling us that you actually have to pay physically. Here's the $100. I'm giving you $100, and without it, he's not koneh. So the Gemara is asking, is that brisa stronger than our own Mishnah? Our own Mishnah says that you don't have to pay. That when you say shilem, it means I'm going to pay. So why do you say that it's a kasha on the Iked Amre of Rav Papa, on the Iked Amre of Rav Papa, who say that he can own it and he hasn't paid yet? Of course he hasn't paid yet. You don't have to pay yet. All you have to do is make a commitment to pay, like our Mishnah. So you hear the kasha. The kasha is, we thought that the chilek between the two versions in Rav Papa is that even though you have, in the first version, we said, oh, he's paying, therefore, even though it's not shchiach, it's not, in other words, it's not often that an animal dies in work, but he paid for it, so he owns it. Got it. But in the Iked Amre, we're saying that that's not the case. Well, why should it be the case? Because that brisa, like our Mishnah, only means a commitment to pay, not an actual payment. That's why the verbiage is so important. It means ba'omar. He said, I will pay. Ochanami ba'omar. So if that's the case, then why is it a tiyufta? Why is it a kasha on the Iked Amre? It's okay. He didn't pay yet. He doesn't have to pay. All he has to do is make a commitment to pay. And when the time comes, he'll give him the $100. So this, what Rav Papa is saying, is slugging up the kasha on the Iked Amre. You, Iked Amre, said that it's okay, that you can say Misa Machmas Malacha, and therefore the show is entitled to kefel when he makes this deal with the owner. But wait a minute, Abaye said you have to pay. No, you don't have to pay. The brisa doesn't mean pay. The brisa means commitment to pay. So that's the kasha here. So he wants to slug up the whole question of the Ikad Amri, that the Ikad Amri is wrong, by saying the Ikad Amri is not wrong. The Ikad Amri is right. You are allowed to make that exchange with the owner, and you don't have to pay. You just have to make a commitment to pay.
Does the commitment have to have details like I'll pay by a certain date?
Probably yes. It probably has to have.
It can't
to
be
be tied
open-ended.
Not open-ended.
It would defeat the purpose.
No, exactly right. It can't be totally open-ended. I'll pay. Yeah, I'll pay on Tesvav Sivan. I'll give you the $100. But not right now, this minute, today, it's Erev Shavuos or something. So he says, I'll pay you in 10 days. No, for sure, there has to be some outline of a deal. It can't just be a hefker. But nevertheless,
we trust that
we
verbal
trust him.
commitment to pay in the future.
As opposed to saying, here's the money. And that's the chilek.
Rabbi Grauman, what if he just said, for sake of argument, that, look, I'll post collateral. And by a certain date, if it doesn't come through, you can collect from me, or the kafel autumn, is diverted from me, whatever. Is that theoretically work?
But collateral is a form of payment, is it not? In other words, I don't have to give you the $100. If I give you something worth 100, that's
Yes.
The payment. You can exchange one thing for another. That's not the problem. The problem is a mere verbal commitment, because we remember by Shoel, we were saying that it's a one-sided affair, that it's b'dibura b'da'alma. In other words, it's just words. There's no teeth to it. If you're going to give me collateral, I'm happy. I'll have something. Maybe you'll exchange the collateral for money, but I'm okay because you gave me something, as opposed to dibura ba'alma.
Okay. Right.
And only a shomer is dibura ba'alma, because by a shomer sochar, you actually gave him rental money, and a shomer chinam was to the benefit of the owner. That's like money too, right? The fact that you're watching something for me, that gives me monetary value. It's only a shoel who is out there without any sort of any commitment.
Thank you.
Yeah. Zok the Gemara Azoi. Me dummy. Wait a minute. You want to compare that brisa to our Mishnah and say, just like in the Mishnah, Shile means a commitment. So too, this means a commitment. No. Hossam Lokatani Kidame. There in the Mishnah, it didn't say Kidame. Remember, I told you words are important. So what is the word kidame? The word kidame, the way we understand it, he is saying that
Went ahead and paid.
he goes ahead. The word kidame means he goes ahead and does it. So now we're splicing language here. Kidame in actuality means he paid. He went ahead and he paid. It's not just I'm going to say it. It's the kidame. He went ahead and paid. So the Gemara now wants to make a chiluk between the brisa and the Mishnah, and saying, even though both of them were verbal, but in one case the verbal was immediately coupled with a kidame. Here, let me take out my wallet. So therefore, in the Mishnah, where it says that he pays, it means the kidame. He actually took out the money to pay. In the brisa, he did not take out the money to pay. So again, this sounds like we may be splitting hairs, okay? We're making a fine distinction between what it means to commit to pay, or to commit to pay and then not, Jay, wait 10 days, but fumble with my wallet and take out my wallet and take out the money. In other words, some action will follow the verbiage, okay? We're being very, very exact here. In both cases, he said, I will pay. But in one case, he couples it with an actual event, albeit a few minutes later, whatever. And then the other, he's pushing it off. So the Gemara wants to say, originally the Gemara wants to say the Mishnah and the Brisa are the same. By the way, a Mishnah is a Brisa. So in other words, they're one and the same. The Gemara wants to say the Mishnah means this and the Brisa means that. Says the Gemara, no, they both say Va'omar. So how could you make a chilik? Says the Gemara, we do make a chilik, because in one it says, in the Mishnah it says kidame, but therefore he's actually paying, whereas in the Brisa he's not. So we're back to the same question. If that's the case, then it's a kasha on the Ikeda Amre. Why should the Ikeda Amre say that he's entitled to do it? He didn't pay for it. Okay. Frag the Gemara, my kidane. What is kidane? Now, so the Gemara wants to ask us, what is kidane? We're using this new word, kidane. Okay, so now help us understand what kidane is, right? My kidane, that he went ahead and he did it. And to the Gemara, kidane va'omar, that he went ahead and he said he would pay for it and paid for it before they found the ganef. In other words, in the sequence of events, the ganef is not yet found. There is a kinyan. Remember, the kinyan is the original kinyan when the owner conveyed it to the Shamachinam Shah, whoever happens to be. So we have a kinyan. We're not worried about a kinyan. Was there a ganef? No ganef yet. So the owner comes to the shomer or to the show and says, you know what? I'm a little nervous that you're owning this. So let's make a deal that if something happens here, you pay me and you're entitled to kefil. So he is basically not conveying, but saying to him that kefil will be yours upon your paying me because we're making a kinyan for that purpose today. Okay, I agree, I'll do that. So now the question becomes, now the events unfold, the ganef steals, and the owner comes to the shomer, to the shayla, and says, okay, remember, we made a deal. So the guy says, yeah, of course we made a deal, and I'm gonna pay you. I'm gonna pay you. It's $100, I'm gonna pay you. So now, so this whole discussion is about the payment. He committed to the payment, but did he make the payment? So the Gemara, the Brisa, originally Abaya says he has to make the payment. By a shoyel, you have to make the payment. It's not enough to make the commitment. Then we asked the Kasha, okay, what about the Mishnah and the Brisa? So we said that there's a chilek, because in the Mishnah, kidain, and in the Brisa, there was no kidain. Break the Gemara, my kidain. What does it mean that he went ahead? That word went ahead has a little bit of a stick to it. What does it mean he went ahead as opposed to what? Not going ahead? So the Gemara says that my kidain va'omar, that remember, he didn't make a commitment to pay for the only thing that they did at the time of the kinyan was they made a kinyan so that the shoel could quote unquote control or be a potential owner of the item. Okay, there was no verbal exchange. I'm buying it from you if something happens. It didn't happen. So now, later on, the owner comes to the shoel and says, you know, I'm a little nervous. What happens if this animal gets stolen or lost or whatever? So he says, you know what? I'm going to buy, he says, I'm going to pay you for it. I will pay you for it if something happens. Says the Gemara, that's pshat kidain. Before the event happened, before it was stolen, or before it died, or before whatever happened, he made a commitment to him. Kidain. He made a commitment to him that I will pay you and take your risk away. So kidain va'omar means not after the event, but before the event, before the Geneva, before the actual event, he made some kind of a pledge to the owner to assuage the owner not to be concerned if something happened to the chayfetz. That's the interpretation of the Gemara of what it means kidei. My kidei va'omar. So Hamidik Tani Gabi Soicher va'omar v'Gabi Shoel kidei shmamina dafka katani. So in other words, since we said it by Soicher, right? We said by Soicher that he is going to commit to pay. And that the Socher said that he would pay. In Gabi Shoel, we said Kidei va'omar, So we see that there's a different lashon, there's a different text between a shoel and a socher. A socher merely has to say he'll pay, and that's sufficient to complete the transaction. The shoel, on the other hand, because debura b'dalma, because all he has in this whole vested interest is words, therefore he has to actually be kideng. He actually has to go ahead and pay. So in other words, we're making a distinction between the shoel and between the other shomrim because of the fact that he does not make any payment. So if that's the case, then what is that? How does that fit in with Rav Papa? Because Rav Papa said that in the second version, the Iked Amr of Rav Papa, we went ahead and said that he may say shchiach, that it's possible that the animal died. If the animal died, then what's his migo? The teretz is he was kidei. He was actually went ahead and made the payment. And if you made the payment, then there's no kasha anymore. Everybody agrees that if you make a physical payment, you're off the hook. There's no question that you're the owner. Remember, this is about ownership. Can the shoel acquire kefil? That's the whole shaila. So we want to say that once he is, we thought now that the shoel is like the soicher, and all he has to do is say, make a commitment to paying, and that's sufficient. Then we would have a problem. Says the Gemara here, no, that there was a chiluk between a shoel and a soicher or a shomer chinam, whereas they can just say va'omar, like our Omar, just I'm saying, and that's sufficient to convey kefel to them because of the migo. But by a shoel, because it's a little bit more tenuous, because all he has is the bura b'alma, by him, it has to be kideng v'shalem. He actually has to go ahead and pay. What do we see from this Gemara? What's very important to understand is that words matter. In other words, we talk about what matters. It matters. To make a commitment in some cases is sufficient, and in some cases a commitment is not sufficient. In some cases you have to go beyond just a commitment. So the Gemara is making a chilik between a shoel and a socher or a shomer chinam. In that case, is that for a socher va'omar is okay because we believe him on his pledge because he has a vested interest. He rented it. He's already paid for it. So we say he has a vested interest. A shoel, on the other hand, is totally arm's length. He has no vested interest. It's the bura ba'alma. So we're saying for the bura ba'alma, you have to make a little bit more than just a verbal commitment. You have to be kideng. You have to say, you know what? I'm putting my money where my mouth is, so to speak. And here is the money. I'm actually paying the money, so you know that I'm emes, and you know that I want to acquire kefel. So that's how the Gemara wants to come to conclude and make this chilik, and therefore saying there's no kasha on Rav Papa whatsoever.
Couldn't they have made this a lot easier by requiring some documentation instead of all of this verbal stuff that complicates everything?
Remember, we're in the era of Torah Shabbat Peh, Jay.
I understand it, but there were other things that were documented that were put down in writing.
Right,
So-
but you know what that may tell us, by the way? This may tell us that among Yidden, there is a element of trust.
Yeah, that's what I
Yidden
was-
trust each other. In other words, President Reagan always says trust but verify, and that's
Right.
kind of our motto: trust but verify. I believe you, but among Yidden, I'm willing to say that even today, among very frum Yidden, there probably isn't a lot of written documents. They say, you'll pay me. Yes, you'll pay me. Fine. We have a handshake. You'll pay me. I trust you. You trust me. Now, is that the best way to go about doing business? It isn't, not because someone will intentionally do something. What about unintentionally? Oh, but I thought I paid. Whatever. So if you have a paper, then you know that it's real. And when the guy pays, you give him the paper back. Just like we do with the ksuba, or we do with with all of the items that we say that we've been talking about all these months. You know what? Here's a halva. Here's the paper back. So if it's lost, who lost it? The lover or the malver? I mean, in other words, we have this kind of discussion because even in our context, we want to be absolutely clear and not allow for, quote, an accidental mistake where someone doesn't remember, did he pay, did he not? And he's going to take advantage of the fact that the paper's not there. But you're right. You're right.
There's another thing which we talked about before. Nowadays, it's no big deal. Anytime we want to write something, we just grab a piece of paper and a ballpoint pen, and 2 seconds we're done. Then they didn't. Paper was a valuable thing. That's why you have in the Genesis and stuff where you have parchment or papyrus or whatever that's been written over and over and written and rewritten over and over. Paper was expensive, or whatever it was they used instead of paper. It wasn't paper as we know it was expensive.
Right.
You didn't have easy pens or pencils even. So it was a quill and an inkwell, this and that. It was a much bigger deal. And so to go do that every time somebody loans somebody else or rent it to somebody else or this or all these different kinds of things, to go write up a document every time was a much bigger deal than it is today.
Right, which is why when I made the quote that we were living in an era of Baal Peh, everything was Baal Peh. There were no writings, so to speak. Even the Gemaras were all conveyed. It was only Rabbi Hyatt, right? So all the Gemaras, everything was kind of like, and even Rashi in his later years, he didn't write anything formally. He wrote on contracing. He found a piece of document and he wrote on it, and that's why some of them were lost. And later his grandson had to recreate. But in other words, it wasn't until I don't know much later, much more recent to our time. I don't know what century. I can't pinpoint when documentation became the actual norm for everything. Then it was happenstance. Yes, yes, no, no. But clearly it was a lot more. It was hefker. It was hefker. It was not with a sense of continuation. Okay,
Rabbi,
so we made that distinction. So let's just
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I'm troubled by the distinction between the shoel and the others, because the shoel is getting something for nothing. Right. In fact, in some instances, they may go in and take the item without asking, and then something happens to it, and they're not required to replace that article that they lost or take accountability in the case of an animal for using something and it happened. So I don't understand why we would make it easier for the shoel who's benefiting greatly to not be accountable for using something which is, he's using for nothing. He's not renting it. He's not doing anything. And then he doesn't have the obligation to reimburse. We are all, the Torah and the Talmud is very consumed, and rightly so, with protecting people's property and the value of their property. Why is this? Why would they say that if he makes a pledge, it's not, you can't keep it?
Right, which is why at the very end of our sugi here, the way we conclude and make the chiluk between the shoel and the socher is to say that it's enough for the socher to say for Omar that I will pay you, but the shoel has to be kidem. The shoel actually has to take the money out of his pocket and pay it. So in other words, to your point, the shoel is not going to get away with anything because it says Shema Mina Dafka Katani.
So does that mean he has to, or only if he wants to?
No. If he wants to engage with the owner to be the owner of Kefel, you know what? I thank you very much for lending me this item, but now I don't want to have anything to do with it. But here, this whole discussion is where the owner is giving the shoel the opportunity to.
So it's just with respect,
right, to possibly get kefel, says the Gemara. In that case where he has the opportunity to get kefel, then dafka katani, there has to be kidem. Without kidem,
he's not eligible. I get it.
Right, we're not going to give him that opportunity.
It's a funny kind of jackpot.
Right.
Yes.
So let's just continue.
Because we're into a situation where there's a double uncertainty going on here.
What's the double?
You may never come to Kefel.
May never come, correct. Right, because remember that even when you barter kefel, remember what we said. Kefel is only if there is a bezdin that gives an injunction for kefel. If he comes and he's moed and he said, you know, I have charata, I took this, I didn't mean to take it, here is it back. It's okay, but then he's made whole. Remember, Jay, at that point he's made whole. He's not at a loss because when a guy is moed, he still has to pay for it. He doesn't walk away free. It's just that there's no kefel. So this whole discussion becomes somewhat moot because everybody got something, but no one got a windfall. No one got kefel. But in the norm, he wouldn't return it, and it would be someone, found it, brought him to Bezdin, sued him, and now he has to pay kefel. So the question is, to who does he have to pay kefel? So according to these circumstances, we're saying that if he actually made the payment, he gets kefel. If he didn't make the payment, kefel still belongs to the owner. He does not get the benefit of kefel. So now the Gemara asks an interesting question. Midi gabe hadadi, Tanya, was this Mishnah and this Brisa learned together? Remember, the Mishnah and the Brisa are somewhat different. So the kasha here is, we're asking all these questions because the Mishnah says one thing and the Brisa says something else. So now the Gemara asks a simple question. Midi gabe hadadi Tanya, was this Mishnah and Brisa learned together so that there is a chilik between the Mishnah and the Brisa? Maybe they weren't even learned together. Maybe the Mishnah was way over here, the Brisa was over here, the Brisa didn't know anything from the Mishnah, and the Brisa is telling us something different. So the Gemara is asking a practical question. When we put these side by side, and what is V'omar and what is V'kidem, is it because they fully analyzed the whole picture and said, this is Kidem and this is not Kidem? In other words, so that's the kasha. Where they really learned at the same time. So the Gemara says, Tanya, Shalina, Latanya, Debei Rabbi Hyatt, Debei Rabbi Oishia, that the Talmidim, Rabbi Hyatt and Rabbi Oishia were obviously that was the Gedolim of the time, and so the Talmidim would ask all these shilas to Rabbi Hyatt and Rabbi Oishia, and they said yes, yeah, they were learned at the same time. In other words, the Talmidim, when they studied the Mishnah, they studied the Brisa. So you can't get away by saying that one didn't know the other, and therefore they may mean the same. You see, if they weren't learned at the same time, you might want to say, yeah, V'omar, V'kidem, yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same thing because you don't have a frame of reference. But if they're learned at the same time, and one says Omar and one says Kidem, you can't wriggle out and say they mean the same. They can't mean the same because you're using a different terminology to describe one set of facts by Ba'omar and another set of facts by B'kidem. So the Gemara says no, they were learned at the same time, and therefore there's no ambiguity. V'amar gabe hadadi tonight. So in other words, we're saying fine. Okay, so that ends that section. That we now know that there is a chiluk between the words, and the words apply differently because we concluded that a shoel is different than a shem esachar or a shem chinam or whoever, and therefore he has a higher obligation of actually having to pay in order to get himself into the discussion of kefil. The others don't have to pay; they can commit to pay. But the shoel, because of dibura ba'alma, gets into the discussion only because he made a payment. Okay, so let's go a little bit weiter. So now we understand that. Now, so the Gemara now we're still talking about kefil and we're still talking about shomrim, but now the Gemara wants to get into it a little bit more, as to what does it mean that a shomer takes upon himself to pay and get kefil? What does that mean? Says the Gemara, Pshita. It's pretty simple. What are you making a big thing? Right? So in other words, let's just listen to what the Shomer is saying. Okay, so what's the kasha pshita? The kasha pshita is, why is it different than any other circumstance where two people make a transaction and one person agrees to pay or not to pay, whatever it happens to be, and therefore he has rights. So the Gemara is trying to understand what is really going on here. So now there's going to be a series of cases, very interesting, where it tests this theory. Oma Eina Mishalem. Let's say the shomer says Eina Mishalem. I'm not paying. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not paying. V'chozav Oma Hareini Mishalem. And then he changes his mind. He says, you know what? I am going to pay. I'm going to pay for the loss of this animal. But he originally said he didn't. Now he says he does. Hoka Omar Hareini Mishalem. Or he says, I'm going to pay. That, in other words, so he wound up by saying, I'm going to pay.
He says it up front, right?
Up front, he says, Eina Mishalem.
Yeah.
He changes his mind and he says, I'm going to pay. So what's the kasha, says the Gemara? He says, I'm going to pay. He changed his mind, right? Or he said, I'm going to pay. And then he changes his mind and says, I'm not going to pay. Now, what the Gemara is probing here is, how do we understand this relationship between the owner and the shomer? In other words, making a pronouncement, is that it? Or does he have a right to rescind his pronouncement? Because remember, we're talking about the subject here is kefel, and whether or not a shomer can sort of buy his way into kefel. Because the shomer would normally say, I'm sorry, it got stolen, and I'm not chayiv. By saying pshia, he's admitting that he's chayiv, and therefore he's angling for kefel. That's what the premise of this Gemara is that by saying I'm chayiv, he's going to compensate the owner will be made whole, and in exchange, the owner will say, you know what, I'm grateful that I'm getting my item back, and therefore you get, if there's any benefit in the future, I'm giving the benefit to you. So now the Gemara is probing, how does that work? Because l'chayra pshita, it should be very simple. If he said I'll pay, then he'll pay. So the Gemara's the hypothesis here is first that he says Eina Mishalem because of Amahari Mishalem, Hahaka Amahari Mishalem, right? He ended up on the right side of it. Ella Omar Hareini Mishalem. Okay, we're up to Lamed Daled Lamed Beis. Because of Eina Mishalem, my. In other words, what's the halacha? Mi Amrinim Mahada Kohadadi Bay. So this is the analysis. Do we say that he actually changed his mind? Oh, Dilma b'milsa koi v'dechuyahu dekor mitchalei. This language is something that we've had repeatedly in the past. Or do we say, no, he's not changing his mind. He really wants to do it, but he doesn't have the ability to pay right now, so he's stalling. So he says, Eina Mishalem, but he doesn't mean Eina Mishalem. He means Eina Mishalem achshav. Right now, I don't have the $100 to give you. So he's kind of out of the side saying, I'm not sure. And remember, we had this Gemara in the past. We analyzed this in the past as to whether when someone denies something, is it really a denial or is it more of a, I'm pushing it off, right? Because I can't do it right now, but I really want to do it. So that's the Gemara. When the Gemara says pshita, it's simple. It's not so simple because what's the motive? Nothing is simple, right?
It's never simple with a pshita.
What?
It's never simple with a pshita.
It's never simple, right? Because you can always look at the two sides of it and say, no, he didn't mean he doesn't want to pay. He just means he can't pay right now, so he's pushing it off, but eventually he will pay. So that's the Gemara Shiur.
But this note here says that he's only eligible for kefel if he, the owner only conveys kefel if the guy voluntarily compensated him. So if the owner takes the guy to Bezdin because he thinks he's given them, Brooklyn Bridge kind of argument,
right?
then that may not apply. But it's only if it's totally voluntary.
No, this has to be totally voluntary. But even totally voluntary, he can fudge. He can fudge and say, yeah, I'll pay you. I'll pay you. In other words, remember, words count. So the premise is this is all voluntary. Once you go to Bezdin and
Right.
Bezdin puts its imprimatur on this case, whole different story. So we're talking about two people who have a discussion and they want to do the right thing by each other. So the owner himself is a nice guy, but he's a little shaky. He doesn't want to lose his chayfetz. So he's willing to give up future potential just to make himself whole. So
Okay.
in this particular case, what is the shomer saying? Is he saying, I'll pay you or not pay you? So if he starts out by saying, I'll pay you, and then he reneges, or he starts out by saying, I won't pay you, and then pay. So then now the Gemara is clearing what's really going on here. And is he saying it the right way because he wants to pay, or is he saying it because he can't afford to pay right now, so he wants to kick the can down the road, but he still wants to pay? So these are ambiguities that our Gemara is trying to wrestle with and understand what is the definitive action that's happening here, and do we say, is it pshita? Is it taka pshita that of course he'll be the owner? Well, wait a minute, it's not pshita because he's really fudging. He's really not wanting to do it. So that's the Gemara's kasha. And
But
now,
Rabbi, he wouldn't be allowed to do the obverse. He couldn't say, I'm not, I mean, I am, and then say I'm not. In other words, he said, I'm going to pay for it, and because I get kafel, or I pledge to pay for it, and then change his mind the other way. He wouldn't, because once he makes the commitment, he's obligated, correct?
no, that's the Gemara's kasha. No, the Gemara's kasha is if a person says, I'm going to pay, and then he immediately says, I'm not going to pay. Or he says, I'm not going to pay, and then changes his mind and say, I'm
So
going
it's
to
both
pay.
ways. It's both.
So the Gemara wants to say, which of his pronouncements are we to believe? Are we to believe his first pronouncement or his second pronouncement? So l'chaira, the second pronouncement should be the one that is the lasting one. So if he says, I'm not going to pay, and then he says, I'm going to pay, he's left with, I'm going to pay. He's left with, I'm going to pay. So we should believe him that he's going to pay. We should. We don't know yet. We should. But if he says, I will pay, and then he goes back and says, no, I'm not going to pay, then the Gemara says, what does that not going to pay mean? Does it mean I'm not going to pay now, but I will pay later? Or does it mean, forget about it, I'm not going to pay? Now, we're in a question status. We're not in a terrorist status yet. We're clearing what do words mean. Remember, this whole sugya that we've been talking about this week and previous is words matter. Words matter. You can't just throw out a word and then not live by it. If you say you can make a commitment, you make a commitment. Sometimes the commitment has to be accompanied with an actual payment, and sometimes it doesn't have to be, as we just learned with a socher and a shoel. So the Gemara picks up from that whole discussion of socher and shoel and wants to give us a series of cases where the question is, what is the commitment? Is what he says definitive, or is it not definitive, and it becomes something that he commits to, but we'll have to see later. So that's what the Gemara is really coming to tell us right now. Okay, so Amma Hareina Mishalem. So a couple more. Amma Hareina Mishalem Umeis. What happens if the shomer says, I'm going to pay for this? Umeis, and he dies. V'omru bonav ein anu mishalmim, and his heirs, his children say, what do you mean? We're not paying you for this, right? We're not paying you for this. What's the halacha? Do we say that they're just stalling? In other words, they really want to commit to what the father said, but they're stalling. Or I'm sorry. Do they that they reneging? Sorry, they're reneging. Or they're standing behind their father, and they're just stalling for time. So it's the same kasha now appears in a circumstance where the father, the shomer committed, but he died. So the question now becomes a new question. Is that commitment carried over to the next generation? So that's a shaila. Again, we don't have the answer yet. That's the shaila. Or shalmei banim mai. What happens if the children completed the transaction and they paid? Now the flip side is the kasha. Let's say they went ahead and paid. So they made him whole. Well, wait a minute. So what the owner is saying, thank you for making me whole, but I'm not conveying kefil to you. The only reason I convey kefil to your father is because I know him and he was good to me and we were friends. So I'm giving him the benefit of a windfall to take kefil. But you paid me for it. Very good. Now, if it's found, you'll get your money back. But I'm not going to give you kefil. So now it's the owner who's going to renege and say that he thanks them for paying, but I'm not going to think, oh, Dilma, lo shna. Or maybe, no, you paid me, you're entitled to kefil. Okay? So in other words, this is yet another kasha as to whether or not once we go not from the same generation to the same generation, what's the halacha? That's what the Gemara is trying to probe here, is once we go into a new generation, is it still a level playing field or not? Or shilin lebanin, if the children paid, right? The children paid. My motza amale ki aknele avuna kefela the avle nachad nafshi. Same thing. When your father paid me, I conveyed kefel because we're good friends. But I don't know you, so you paid me. Thank you very much. If it's found, you'll get it back. Or there's no difference between the father and the children. And then I think we have one more. Shilmu bonim lebanim. What happens if both generations died? The shomer and the owner, and the children of the shomer paid to the children of the owner. So what's the halacha? We don't know. Shile mechza mai. What happens if he paid for half of the? Let's say he lent him 2 animals and he paid for 1 animal. So what's the din? In other words, is that sufficient for the second animal or not? Or 2 paras. If he borrowed from 2 shutfin and he paid to 1 shutf and not the other, there's a whole sequence of halacha on what happens if you borrow from 2 people and pay only 1 back, which means you haven't paid the second guy, right? Or vice versa, 2 partners borrowed and 1 paid back. What about the other? What happens if you borrowed from a woman? Remember, nichse melug, we said that there is ownership of, the woman has the ownership of nichse melug, which is the ksuba, but the husband is allowed to use it during his life. So what happens if you borrowed from the nichse melug, v'shilem lebala, and you paid it back to the husband? Who owns it, the baal or the woman? It's her nichse melug, but you're paying the husband. Isha shisholas v'shilem bala. If a woman borrows and the husband repays, okay. And for the Gemara, teko. So I just want to list all these because all of these are very complicated questions, and the Gemara says teko, which ultimately means we don't have an answer. We have to wait for Eliyahu Navi. But when you think about it, think of each one of these particular circumstances, and you'll see that each one raises a question which, on the surface, may be a stira to what we know. Because what we know is what we said in the beginning. You know, you borrow, you make a deal, you pay. By Shaul, you pay. By Shemechina, Shemesachar, or Seicha, you make a commitment to pay. That's clear on its face. All of these shilas have a little bit of a twist to them. So when you think about each one of these cases, about these 6 or 8 cases, they're not on par with what we know to be the actual halacha. So the Gemara is clearing, how do we go? Which way do we go? Do we say it's okay to repay to one of the shutfin and not to the other? Or do we say it's okay to pay to the husband, the nichse melug, and not to the wife? Why? It's nichse melug. So it's actually food for thought. We're leaving us with a lot of shilas, but the bottom line is that this is not a very simple matter, is that the halacha is the halacha, but once you get away from the black letter halacha, now you're in sort of uncharted territory, and it's not clear whether or not one has to repay or not repay. That's the point the Gemara wants to make, is teko, that it's not so simple. I think that we'll hold the Rashis, we'll go over all the Rashis, but I just wanted to make that point, that all of these cases are somewhat of an aberration from what we know to be the actual halacha. And you can speculate, we can argue, we can certainly conjure up all kinds of arguments. Yes, it is, no, it isn't. But the Gemara says, teko, we don't have a real answer as to what's definitive in all of these cases. So it's fascinating to see how the Gemara comes out on this. All right. So yeah. Yeah. So it's an interesting opening argument. We'll continue with the Rashis, and then we'll pick up Mitzvah Shem from Lamed Daled Amud Beis.